At some point, some people start noticing something strange about society. Things that everyone seems to accept start to look questionable. Not wrong necessarily, but arbitrary. You hear things like, "That's just how it's done. That's normal. That's what people do." And instead of feeling reassured by that, you feel a bit unsettled. Because everyone does it doesn't really explain anything. It just describes repetition. And if that's something you've noticed, you've probably also experienced the reaction that comes with it. When you question something that most people accept, the response is rarely curiosity. It's usually discomfort. "Why are you overthinking this?" "You're making it complicated." "Just go with it." And after a while, you start wondering if it would just be easier to stop questioning things, to go along, to not create friction. But here's the part that's easy to miss. That moment where something starts to feel off is often the beginning of something important. Because once you start seeing through certain norms, you can't really unsee it. You begin to notice patterns. How certain behaviors are repeated without much reflection. How expectations are passed on without being examined. How entire ways of living are treated as default without anyone clearly choosing them. At first, it's subtle. You just feel a kind of mismatch. You're in a situation that is completely normal, but something doesn't fully align. A conversation about career paths, a discussion about relationships, a decision that everyone seems to agree on. And internally, there's a pause. Not rejection, just distance. You're not fully inside it, you're observing it. And that's a shift. Because most people operate from within these norms. They don't see them as structures, they experience them as reality. But once you start seeing them as structures, you also realize something else. They're not fixed. They exist because people keep repeating them, not because they are inherently correct. And that realization changes how you relate to them. You don't automatically reject norms, but you also don't automatically follow them. You evaluate them. You start asking, where does this come from? Does this actually make sense? What is this optimizing for? Do I want the outcome this leads to? And this is where the first effect shows up: clarity. Because instead of inheriting patterns, you start understanding them. You see the trade-offs, the assumptions, the consequences. And that allows you to make more deliberate choices. Not necessarily different for the sake of being different, but different when it actually matters. Now, this doesn't happen in isolation, because the moment you step slightly outside of a norm, you feel it. There's friction, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct. A look, a comment, a question that carries a bit more weight than it seems. Why would you do it that way? Isn't that risky? Why not just do what works? And this is where many people stop. Because friction is uncomfortable. It's easier to align, to not stand out, to stay within what's already accepted. But if you keep following that line of questioning, something else starts to develop. You begin to separate two things: what is common and what is actually meaningful to you. And those two are not always the same. This is where a second effect appears: independence. Not in a dramatic sense, not in a going against everything way, but in a quieter way. You're no longer automatically shaped by what surrounds you. You're still influenced by it, but you're not fully defined by it. And that changes how you move through decisions. At work, this might mean questioning processes instead of just executing them. Not to disrupt, but to understand if they still make sense. In relationships, it might mean not following predefined scripts, not assuming that things have to look a certain way. In life choices, it might mean not optimizing for what is most accepted, but for what is most aligned. And that creates something else: a sense of ownership. Because your decisions are no longer defaults, they're selected. and that changes how they feel. Even when they're uncertain, they're yours. Now, there are trade-offs. Seeing through social norms can feel isolating, because once you step slightly outside of them, you realize how much they structure interactions. What people talk about, what they expect, what they assume. And if you don't fully share those assumptions, there's a slight gap. You're present, but not fully aligned. And that can feel like being slightly out of sync. Not disconnected, just not fully embedded. But there's also a paradox here. That distance gives you perspective. You can see things that are invisible from the inside. You notice patterns, repetitions, unquestioned habits. And over time, this builds something. Not just awareness, but freedom. Because once you see that something is a pattern, you realize you can step out of it. Not easily, not without friction, but it becomes possible. And that's where the real shift happens. You stop asking, what do people usually do? And you start asking, what actually makes sense here? That question changes everything, because it moves you from imitation to intention. And over time, that compounds. Small decisions, small deviations, small moments where you choose differently. They start shaping your life in a different direction. Not radically at first, but gradually, until at some point, you realize something. Your life doesn't follow a template. Not because you rejected everything, but because you filtered everything and kept what made sense. Now, again, this is not about rejecting society. Norms exist for a reason. They simplify things. They coordinate behavior. They reduce friction. The point is not to remove them. It's to see them. Because once you see them, you can decide when to use them and when not to. And that's the difference. You're no longer inside the system without awareness. You're interacting with it consciously. So if you've started noticing that certain things feel arbitrary, that certain expectations don't fully make sense, it doesn't mean something is wrong. It might mean you're starting to see the structure behind what most people take for granted. And yes, that comes with friction. But it also opens something else. The possibility to choose. Not based on what is expected, but based on what actually aligns. And that's often where personal freedom begins. Not in big, dramatic decisions, but in small moments where you stop following automatically and start deciding deliberately. That's the shift.